Okay, so this is a video on child support and how it's calculated. Child support is financial support that's paid by one parent to the other. Usually it's paid to the parent who has the child living primarily with them. And it's based on a formula where both parents, their incomes are plugged into the formula, and depending on how many children they have, X amount of dollars comes out of the formula, and that is financial support that is paid by one parent to the other. So child support can either be paid at the end of a case involving children, or it can be paid what's called pendente lite, so during litigation. So there's often a need for a child support order pendente lite if there's a ongoing divorce and the parents are living apart from one another, or there's an ongoing custody case where the parenting plan is still being worked out, but the parents are living apart. In that case, you're going to often need a pendente lite child support order so that the parent who's, generally speaking, has the children living primarily with them. But in other cases, if there's a 50-50 parenting plan, there can be child support that's paid by the higher income earner to the lower income earner. But there's often a need for support while a case is pending. So I'm going to share my screen to kind of go over how this is calculated. So again, it's based on a formula, and that formula is dictated by the Connecticut Child Support Guidelines, which you can just find it if you search child support guidelines, and it should be, the top result or one of the first results. And there's this whole packet of information that, goes over different laws and rules surrounding child support. But we're not going to get into too many of those details here today. But to go over the basics, we're going to look at plugging the information into family law software. So if you're a self-represented individual or you're not an attorney, you're not going to have access to family law software. So some of this may not apply as far as figuring out how it is done in family law software. But if you don't have access to this software, the folks at the courthouse who work in the family relations office, they will help with calculating child support. So just to go over how to do it in family law software. So you first have to do background and information of the children. So this is just the sample case. So John Doe versus Jane Doe, and then you have to type in the children. So in this scenario, we've got two kids, one born in 2013, one born in 2015. We've got custody for the guidelines going to Jane. So this, what you're putting here is the parent who has the children living primarily with them. And then we put the tax exemption. So normally you're going to have this either alternating. If there's one child, you would usually put this alternating, or if there's two, then normally you would just put each, one parent claiming one of the children and the other claiming the other child. But obviously these things can be different. And then you're going to go to enter data and put income and expenses. So you have to enter the income of both of the parents. And we usually do, child support awards are usually based on a weekly child support amount. And, for income, the courts usually look at weekly income on the child support or on the financial affidavits and, on the child support guidelines. So what you're going to do is, you click on both parties and you put in the weekly income of each of the parties. So I think in this situation we've got, just a hypothetical. We put John at $38.46 a week, and we put Jane at half of that, so $19.23 a week. I believe that's $200,000 and $100,000 for income per year. And then the software is going to automatically calculate the tax deductions, the tax withholdings on on the financial affidavit. So that is automatically calculated. And then what you often have to manually put in are the health insurance deductions. So that is going to be plugged in down here on number 5. So you just put you're going to have to figure out the weekly health insurance premiums that each parent pays. Sometimes one of the parents will not have any health insurance premiums, but usually they do. So once all of that information is plugged in, then you just come over to reports and you click on child support guidelines, and the guideline sheet should be filled out. So if you're looking at the guidelines, how it works is this is going to be the gross income of both of the parents, and then it's going to take all the deductions down here, and then it plugs in the health insurance deductions. And then if you keep scrolling down, so these are all the total deductions. And then this is the net income of each of the parties, each of the parents, after all the deductions come out. And then how child support is calculated is the court will look at the combined net weekly income. So if you combine the net weekly income of both of these parents, who are earning $100,000 and $200,000 respectively, the combined net weekly income after deductions is $3,990, which, based on the child support guidelines, dictates a total child support amount of $707 per week. And that is determined based on this chart here, which is part of the child support guidelines. So the court will look at, okay, they have a combined net weekly income of $3,990. And then, so these columns are based on how many children there are. So this is 1 child, this is 2 children, this is 3 children, etc. So in this situation, we've got 2 children. So the court's going to take 17.72% of the combined net weekly income, and then they're going to come up with a $707 total child support award. Now, that does not mean that there's $707 in child support that's paid. That means that would be the basic, the total child support allocation. So you can kind of ignore this number. And again, you don't really have to know the nuances of this. I'm just trying to explain how the amount is determined, but because ultimately the child support guidelines are going to automatically do a lot of these calculations. But so the 707 is the total basic child support obligation. And then on line, I think this is line 17, there are these certain percentages. So this is the percentage each parent has of the total net income before child support is paid. So again, the total net income is $39.90. And then in this scenario, John's net income is $25.82. So he has 64.84% of the combined net weekly income. And then Jane has 1403 divided by 39.90, which is, she has 35% of the combined net weekly income. So how the weekly child support amount is determined is you multiply this total child support obligation by the percentage here. So in this scenario, we've got John paying child support to Jane. So it's essentially 64.84% of this $707 per week number. And it comes out with $458 per week that is paid by John to Jane. Now, if this was reversed and Jane was going to be paying John child support, she would be paying him 36.16% of this 707 number. So that is how the weekly child support amount is calculated. Now, part of child support is also each parent's contribution to certain expenses. So in addition to child support, the parties also have to take into consideration work-related childcare expenses and unreimbursed medical expenses. So co-pays, any out-of-pocket medical expenses. And those are generally divided in certain percentages by the parents. That's in addition to the weekly child support amount. So how those percentages are calculated based on the child support guidelines. So how that is determined is the court will look at each parent's percentage of the net weekly income after child support is paid. So again, this is the pre-child support net weekly income, but the court will then calculate, okay, after Jane receives the $458 per week in child support, this is Jane's net weekly income, and this is John's net weekly income. So in this, so before child support was paid, John had 64% of the net weekly income, but after he pays the $458 per week, he only has $21.24 left, and Jane has $18.61 left. So in that scenario, you would, and again, this is calculated automatically by the family law software, but you would take, for Jane, you would divide 1861 by 3990, and that should come out to her having 47% of the net income after child support is paid, and John should have 53% of the net income after child support is paid. So because that's the net income after child support, that means that John will pay 53% of work-related childcare expenses, and Jane will pay 47% of childcare, work-related childcare and unreimbursed medical expenses. And again, that's above and beyond the weekly child support amount. So that's kind of how the child support is calculated, and the additional unreimbursed medical expenses, et cetera. Those are the basics. There's some additional nuances to the child support guidelines. If, for example, one parent has, additional children from prior relationships who they have to pay child support for, that can change things a bit. Or if there are disability benefits that are received, let's say, one parent has the child living primarily with them, but they receive disability benefits based on the disability of the obligor. So the parent who does not have the child living with him or her, if that person is disabled and therefore the custodial parent receives disability benefits, that can change the weekly child support amount. But we're not going to get into all of the nuanced details of that. And then there is a maximum, if you look at the child support guidelines, it bases it kind of stops at $4,000 a week combined net weekly income of the parents, but the court can, which is essentially the scenario that we ran. So the guidelines will max out at a certain weekly child support amount, but that doesn't mean that that's the maximum child support award. The court can actually deviate upward from that maximum amount based on certain circumstances. So those are kind of the basics of the child support calculation. Now, normally child support is also, one parent may work overtime where they are working, 55 hours a week or something like that. So for child support purposes, the court is generally capping the income figure at 45 hours per week. So if one parent earns a certain income based on working 50 hours a week, the court's not going to take that total 50 hours per week of income into consideration. Normally, they're usually going to only look at their income for 45 hours per week. So that is the kind of the basics of child support. Now, there are certain situations in which the court can deviate from the weekly child support amount. And the most common scenario is, well, there's a number of scenarios, but some examples are there can be a deviation based on a shared parenting plan. So if there's a shared 50-50 parenting plan, how child support is calculated is you're normally going to run the guidelines as if the higher income earner is paying child support to the lower income earner. And you're going to run that scenario. So in this situation, if Jane and John had 50-50 custody, you would still run the child support guidelines as we did, which is running it as John paying Jane, and it comes out as $458 per week. Now, if the parents have a 50-50 custody schedule, the court's not necessarily going to think it's fair for John to pay Jane the full child support amount, because normally you would be paying that full child support amount if the children were living primarily with Jane. But because it's a 50-50 schedule, the court's normally going to, deviate. They're going to reduce that amount down to a lower number based on the shared parenting plan. Now, they're not going to do zero child support because John's income is significantly higher than Jane's. So because his income is higher than hers, he should, the court's going to say he should still pay her some child support based on, in order to financially support the children, because he has more resources to support the children. So he's going to pay her some child support amount, but normally it's going to be less than the $458 per week. Now, let's say Jane and John have the same income. If they have the same income in a 50-50 parenting plan, there's usually not going to be any child support because they have the same financial resources. So there's really no need to deviate. It should be that's normally a no child support scenario if the parents are earning the same. And it's kind of a sliding scale where, the higher the discrepancy of income between the two parents in a 50-50 parenting plan, that's going to kind of increase the child support amount that is paid by one to the other. Some other scenarios where there's a deviation from the weekly child support award is if one of the parties has substantial financial assets. So let's say the child support obligor, so the person who is obligated to pay child support, let's say they don't have any income or they're working a minimum wage job. That would that would put the weekly child support amount quite low. But if they have, if let's say they've inherited $1 million from their parents, the court's not gonna view it as fair for that person to pay, child support based on minimum wage because they have substantially higher resources to support their child, based on that large asset that they have. So in that scenario, the court will say, okay, the weekly child support amount is X amount of dollars based on the minimum wage income of the obligor, but we're going to deviate based on the fact that the obligor has substantial assets from which they can pay child support. Some other scenarios are spousal support, financial support that is paid by a spouse or domestic partner. So let's say a obligor got remarried or has, a domestic partner that they're living with, and that person has significant financial resources and they are paying, they're basically paying all the expenses of the child support obligor, thus allowing the obligor to not have to work. The court's not going to say, okay, you're not working, so you don't have to pay any child support. They're going to look at the financial support that is being paid by the new spouse or domestic partner, and they're going to look at that and say, okay, you're receiving significant financial support from your new partner, therefore you have to pay some amount higher than what the child support award dictates. Some other examples of deviation criteria are earning capacity. So if somebody is just not working, but they have the ability to earn a living, let's say somebody's not working or they're working a minimum wage job, but they really have the ability to go out and earn $75,000 a year, $100,000 a year. The court's going to impute their income for child support purposes and plug in what their earning capacity is rather than what their actual income is to calculate the child support amount. So those are kind of the basic deviation criteria, and those are the basics of child support. Obviously, it can be much more nuanced, and there's the child support guidelines are, I don't know, 70 pages long. So there's a lot more nuance, but those are pretty much the basics of child support.